Welcome to this IU Northwest Community Garden session, a beginner's guide to gardening with native plants. Our presenter today is Katie Hobgood. Katie has 15 years of project management and community outreach experience, as well as a passion for inspiring others to become environmental stewards. As the program director at Save the Dunes, she coordinates the organization's project portfolio and leads their conservation projects, working closely with regional partners to enhance native biodiversity, restore ecological integrity, and improve public access to nature in Northwest Indiana. Katie loves gardening and has been working for years to rewild her yard by introducing native plants and a variety of water and habitat features to her property. Welcome, Katie. We appreciate your taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you for having me. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We have a packed agenda today, so I'm going to jump right in. I've been working with Save the Dunes for the past 5.5 years, and during that time, I have had the privilege of learning from many brilliant colleagues about the importance of native plants and their role in our ecosystems, and I've had the opportunity to engage with communities to try and share resources to encourage homeowners to put native plants in their landscaping. In addition to that, over the past, I would say about 3 years, I've been on a personal native gardening journey. So today I'm planning on sharing perspectives from kind of both of those angles, from a how-to for benefiting ecological health, but also some of the things that I've learned through my personal gardening experience. I also want to introduce you to my dogs because they're always with me and they're in a lot of my pictures. And so I didn't want you to just be like, wait, who are those dogs? So this is Emmett and Ivy. Emmett is the one with his ears up, and Ivy has her ears folded down. So they will be making cameos throughout the presentation. You're welcome, because they are so, so cute. So if you're not familiar, Save the Dunes is an environmental nonprofit working in Lake Porter and LaPorte counties of Northwest Indiana. Our mission is to protect and advocate for the Indiana Dunes, Lake Michigan, and the surrounding natural areas for the health and vitality of the environment and the people who live, work, and recreate in Northwest Indiana. And we carry out our mission through our project work in advocacy, conservation, and community engagement. So we do a lot of community engagement around native gardens, usually in the context of supporting pollinator populations. So over here on the right, you can see this is a resource that we're going to be talking more about in just a bit. This is our pollinator guide. So this is a free resource that we have created to help folks incorporate native plants into their gardens. And the guide is specific to Northwest Indiana, but a lot of the content is applicable beyond our region, and this presentation in general, I think, could be used anywhere, really. It's just that some of the plants might not be native. So if you are watching this and you're not from Northwest Indiana, welcome. I think this will still be helpful for you. You'll just have to do a little bit of background information to make sure that the plants that we're talking about are going to work for your space as well. Also want to point out, I love taking pictures of pollinators on flowers. So all of the pictures in the presentation are ones that I've taken in my garden. I don't get a chance to show them off very often. So I'm like, ooh, captive audience, you get to look at my picture. So look at this ridiculously fuzzy bumblebee on this black-eyed Susan. It's the cutest thing. Okay, so here is our agenda. And it's a lot. We're going to be going, staying fairly high level, doing a 101 style overview of all the things you need to know with the goal of giving you the information that you will need in order to install a native garden this spring. There's a lot of planning work that we're going to be talking about. So yeah, this is everything we're talking about. Why native plants? There's some key terms that I want to talk about, so we're talking the same language. How to set yourself up for success, selecting the plants for your space, the pros and cons of using like plant plugs versus seeds, where you can get native plants and seeds. I'm going to show you some examples from my garden of kind of what you can expect when you venture down this path. And we'll talk about plant care and maintenance, and then a little bit about volunteering. And I just have to, this is one of my favorite pictures. Look at the little bee tongue. This is a zigzag goldenrod. Normally, like this is the blooming. These haven't opened yet, but oh, so cute. Okay. So let's start with why native plants. So over on the left, this is an example of a food web. You may have heard of a food, oh gosh, what is it? Food, well, okay, anyway, food web. This is more realistic of how ecosystems work in nature. Chain, food chain, that's what I was trying to think of. So food chain, you think is kind of like a circle, right? That's what I learned in elementary school. But now we use this visual of a food web because it's not just one thing eating the next thing, eating the next thing. Everything's eating everything, right? So it looks a lot more like a web with all these arrows going everywhere. But plants are at the base of every food web because they are they have this unique ability to take energy from the sun and transform it into something that everything else can eat and get energy from. So without plants, there is nothing else. We have to have plants. And why native plants specifically are important is because native plants have evolved in a particular region alongside all of the other insects, animals, and they have these special relationships that have taken thousands of years to develop. So they have the ability to provide optimal nutrition for the insects and animals that are in that ecosystem. So a common example that is used, it's like when thinking about pollinators looking for nectar or pollen on a plant, if they go to a native plant, that's sort of like eating a whole foods diet. It's super nutritious. Where if they're going to a non-native plant, that's a little bit more like junk food. Like they're still getting some nutritional value from it for sure, but it's not nearly as nutritious as if they chose a native plant. So having native plants in your yard provides this really valuable nutritional asset for the wildlife in your home ecosystem. And unfortunately, native plant populations are in decline, mainly due to habitat loss and invasive species. So if you are able to put native plants into your yard, that is a huge win. It could fight back against that habitat loss and have your yard serve as a bit of an oasis for pollinators to be able to come and thrive in your space. Okay, so key terms to know. These are four terms that you're going to come across pretty frequently once you start getting into the native plant world. The first two, we're talking native plant versus non-native plant. So these are talking about the origin of where that plant originated. A native plant is a plant that occurs naturally in a specific region. So they are adapted to the climate, geography, the hydrology of that region, and they've evolved together and formed symbiotic relationships with other native plants and wildlife over thousands of years. So in comparison, non-native plants are plant species that do not occur in a particular region naturally and have been introduced there. And that is often done by humans, either intentionally or accidentally. A lot of times we bring plants over. A lot of times they're coming from either Europe or Asia as ornamental plants. We think they're pretty. So we put them in their yards, and then later we find out that maybe that wasn't such a good idea. But native and non-native, and side note, non-native is also sometimes called introduced. But those are the two kind of options for where that plant originated from. Now, when we're talking about aggressive versus invasive, these two terms are talking about behavior. How does that plant behave? So an aggressive plant, that's a plant that spreads quickly, sometimes outcompeting other plants. An invasive plant is a non-native plant that spreads aggressively and harms the environment, economy, or human health. That's like the technical definition of an invasive plant. But these are similar terms, but the key difference is that invasive plants are always non-native. So I like to look at this more visually. I'm a big fan of Punnett squares, so I made a Punnett square. So if we're looking at like how to classify, what to call this plant, if it's originally from our region and it coexists in balance with other plants, we would just call that a native plant. That's the most common term that we would use. If that plant is originally from our region, but it spreads quickly and can outcompete other plants, we would call that aggressive. That's an aggressive native plant. So some common examples would be goldenrod, Canada goldenrod, excuse me, common milkweed, and sassafras. A lot of times those are also like called weedy plants, but these are still native, but they act aggressively. Now, if the plant is not originally from our region, but it coexists in balance with other plants, we're going to commonly call that non-native. So the only like common example that I could think of is a dandelion, which seems like it would be problematic because we're most often battling it in lawns, but you have to remember that your lawn is one plant, it's monoculture, so it's not very hard to compete with one plant. But think about it in the context of a forest. If you go to a forest, you're not seeing dandelion taking over all the other native plants. It's basically coexisting pretty well. There are a lot of other examples, but this is just the one that I knew everyone would be familiar with. So then if a plant is not originally from our region, but it spreads quickly and can outcompete other plants, then we would call it invasive. So some examples would be Callery pear, burning bush, and periwinkle. So I just want to point this out because the term invasive is often misused. If a plant is native, if it's originally from our area, it technically cannot be invasive because part of the definition of an invasive plant is that it's not from our region. So hopefully that makes sense. You can look into that more. There's tons of information online, but I think it's important to words matter, right? And when you're getting into a new hobby, you're trying to learn more, or maybe even talking to other people about putting natives in their plants, or maybe removing invasives from their yard, it's good to, have the right terminology at hand. Okay, so setting yourself up for success. Before you even start looking at what plants to put in, these are some pre-work questions that I would highly recommend looking into. This is going to help you go through the process of planning your garden more thoughtfully, and it will help you eliminate some maybe missteps that might happen down the road. So the first thing that you want to do is understand what your goals are. What are you trying to achieve? Maybe you just want a low maintenance garden, and you heard that natives can do that, which they can. They tend to be low maintenance once you get them established. Maybe you're looking to help pollinators. Maybe you're trying to recreate habitat. These are all valid reasons. There's no wrong reason to put in native plants, but understanding what your goals are going to help you later when you're trying to narrow down your plant list. Then for reference, because I'm going to keep coming back to this, like what my goals are for my garden impact the way that it looks and the decisions that I made. So I am trying to rewild my garden. I'm trying to create habitat, make it look at least similar to what it might have looked like before the area was developed. So we'll keep coming back to that. I like a wild natural garden, but you don't have to. You don't have to like a wild natural garden. You could have something that looks more landscaped and manicured if that is what your goal is. So we'll be coming back to this. Another key question is identifying any potential barriers that you might run into. And I would highly advise being realistic. Just FYI, I didn't do either of these two things before I started. And so these caused me a lot of grief. So that's why I'm advising that you do these up front. Do you have rabbits or deer or groundhogs in your yard? Like they're still going to be there when you put in your native garden. So that's something to keep in mind as you're planning. Are you kind of not always great at going and weeding your garden? You know that about yourself. You're not going to be a super weeder. Then, maybe you can plant things closer together or do real thick mulch, like just having in your mind what could potentially trip you up at the beginning is going to lessen those things down the road. And I would recommend starting small. Particularly if you are brand new to native plants, just so you can get some early successes, and then that's going to get you excited and drive you to keep going. But if you go too big, and then it just becomes too much of a chore for you and you let it go, and then it's not gonna look nice, and then you're gonna hate native plants and your neighbors are gonna be like, ah, those people and their native plants are the worst. So I would recommend starting small. Now, did I start small? No, I did not. So if you are like super jazzed and really motivated and you want to do something big, I am not going to be the person to stop you. But if you are brand new to this hobby, I would recommend doing something a little bit smaller. And then finally, um, I would recommend doing your research up front. This is not one of those things where you just want to go out to the store and see what they have that's pretty. Like, you want to have a list of plants that you want to purchase that are specifically chosen for your site, for your project. So you'll want to do research beforehand, definitely. So let's talk about this list, because I mentioned our pollinator guide, which you can download. If you're not on your phone, you can scan this QR code with your phone, or this is the link here. It's savedunes.org/resources. And I think that we're going to be sending out this link in the follow-up email after the webinar. But if you go to savedunes.org, the resources tab is in the top right, and then it will be the first thing listed under guides down here. So you can download this for free. And it is a fantastic resource. This is just a few of the pages from the guide. It outlines a ton of different native plants, and this is geared towards their relationship with pollinators, which is very cool to me because that's something I also care about. But you don't have to care about pollinators. You could just want native plants. And these are, this is a really good list. And again, this is just a couple of the pages. We also have landscaping layout samples, as well as plant list for your specific garden type. So there's like a rain garden in here. The oak savanna is like the partial sun garden, part shade, part sun garden. So these are the plants that would do well there. There's one for full sun, there's one for full shade. So there's a lot of different lists here, where this is actually where I started, where I have a part sun garden that I was trying to do. So this is the list that I started with. So we've done a lot of the work for you. You just download this, and then you look at the plants and say, okay, here we go. This is my list. And technically you could stop there, I guess, but we're not going to, of course. We're going to talk about the logistics of kind of the process you go through of selecting plants. So this process is going to be similar to any garden project that you've done. You're asking a lot of the same questions with a few additions. So your first question is going to be, is it native? The plants listed in our pollinator guide are native to Northwest Indiana, but that doesn't mean that they're all native to where you are. You know, even if you're in Illinois or Michigan, some plants have a smaller range, or maybe we're at like the northern reach of their range. So it's good to look it up just to double check. Here are a couple resources that you can use. The National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder is probably the most popular one. You just go in and you put in your zip code, and then it will give you a list of plants that are native to your area. And you can kind of start filtering that way. My personal favorite is Prairie Moon Nursery. I just like the usability of it, works for me. This one, you go in and you type in the plant you want to look up, and then it will, you can see this map. So this is an example of a map from Prairie Moon, and all the light green are the counties where this plant is native to. And it happens to be this plant. This is the blue vervain. So it's widely native in the Midwest, but there's a different map for each plant. And then Prairie Moon also tells you a lot of this information that we're going to talk about now. So you've confirmed that the plant you're looking at is native. So next, your question is going to be about your site conditions. What is your sun exposure? What soil do you have? How much moisture is in the area? Many native plants are pretty generalist, I would say. Like, they can tolerate a range of things. But some are not. Some are more specific. Like, some really like sandy soils and aren't going to grow well in clay soil. Some really don't, they're woodland plants, so you don't want to put them in the sun. You want to put them in a shade garden. Some really love wet. They want wet feet. So if you have an area of your garden or your yard that floods a lot, that would be like a really good plant to put there. So yeah, site conditions is kind of the first basic question. Then I would go to visual appeal. Many native plants can get quite tall. So you're going to think back to your goals that you set. Like, what do you want your garden to look like? Are you okay with having very tall things? And if it's very tall, you're probably going to need to give it some support or plant things around it that will support it. So, like, does that align with your vision? How big do you want it to get? Because some native plants will kind of get a little bushy looking. Some are just like tall stalks. Some are lower. There's all shapes and sizes. Um, so understanding what you want for your space is going to be important. And then the spread is also a very important question. We talked about the aggressiveness of the plant. Some native plants are going to spread. So if you have a small area, you don't want to choose aggressive plants. But if you have an area that you would like to get filled in and you don't, mind if something puts up a bunch of babies, then maybe you do want to incorporate. So again, it's going to depend on what your goals are. The bloom color and the aesthetic of your garden are, again, personal choices. I like to mix up the colors, but maybe you want to do like a one color garden. That could be kind of cool. And the aesthetic is more about that, like, I like a wild looking garden. I want it to look like I'm in a nature preserve in my backyard. But if that's not what you're going for, then you should be looking at those plant descriptions and seeing, like, if this plant gets really bushy, that might not be what you're looking for. Maybe you want something that's going to stay a little bit smaller. You're probably going to want to plant them further apart so that you have that kind of spacing look of a more traditional garden. So those are additional considerations. And then finally, the ecosystem benefits of native plants. It's ideal to have plants blooming during the entire growing season. So from early spring to late fall, you want to have something blooming so that the pollinators have something to get nutrition from. So the pollinator guide that we have, that is laid out by bloom time, so you can choose some from the list in all seasons. And then the host plant relationship, which I'm not going to go too far into detail, but that is also outlined in our pollinator guide. If you think like monarchs and milkweed, that's like a special relationship that butterfly has with that native plant. Well, most native butterflies and moths have that kind of relationship with one plant or a small group of plants. So if you incorporate those host plants, then you're going to attract those butterflies, if that makes sense. So again, if you're more interested in learning more about that, you can check out that pollinator guide, and it's detailed in detail in that guide. One other thing that I forgot to put on this slide is that it's ideal to put more than one plant together in like a little group, so that when the pollinators come, they have multiple plants to nectar on, and it's not just one plant and then they have to go off and find a new plant. Because interesting fun fact, many bees, they like forage on one type of plant at a time. So like this bumblebee in this picture is foraging on blue vervain, and I just watch them. They go through my garden and they go blue vervain, blue vervain, blue. They're not going from like one plant to the next to the next. Some pollinators will do that, but a lot of bees are sticking with one plant at a time. So it's nice to have multiple plants right next to each other so they don't have to travel far to get their next meal. Okay, so let's talk about plants versus seeds. You've got your list of plants that you want to incorporate into your garden now. So how do you actually go about doing it? Most people are going to go towards plants. And for like true beginners, that is what I would definitely recommend. It's a lot more controlled. But I want to mention seeds because I'm a big fan and I'm hoping that after you get your first taste of native plant gardening and you just fall in love and you want to do your next big project, that seeds might be a good option to help you with that. So we're going to talk about some details here. Okay, so let's start with plants. The pros is that plants mature faster. So if you plant native plants from a plant or a plug, they're more likely to bloom in their first year. Not all of them will, but it's much more likely that they will if you get them at the plant stage. It's also easier to predict what your garden is actually going to look like because you put a plant right there. You know it's going to grow, you know how big it's going to get, so you can kind of envision that a lot easier. And it's easier to weed because, again, like you know where you put the plant, and so anything growing around it is probably, needs to be removed. The cons of plants is that they're more expensive, and more labor intensive. Obviously, you have to dig the hole and bury them, which is not a problem if you're doing a normal size garden addition. But if you're doing a big section, then that's kind of where seeds might be a fun alternative for you to consider. So let's talk about seeds. The pros, they're much less expensive than plants, so it's easier to cover large areas and less labor upfront. Not no labor, you still have to prepare the ground, but you're not digging a bunch of holes, so it's faster and easier. But it will take the plants longer to mature, so it's a delayed gratification. Most plants will not bloom in their first year if you start them from seed. And it's less predictable. If you spread 50 seeds, maybe 50 of them will grow, maybe 2 of them will grow. You don't really know until, they start growing. So you might have to add more later, or you might have to like separate out a bunch of plants. You just don't know until it happens. And then not all plants grow well from seed. There are some of those complicated ones that we won't get into, but just an FYI. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of projects that I have undertaken over the past 3 years, and we're going to start with the project where I used plants and plugs. So I bought many of my plants from native plant sales. So over on the right, this is from the Friends of Indiana Dunes native plant sale a couple of years ago. This is kind of what they look like when you go. They're divided by species. And then over on the left, this is some plants that I bought from the Dunes Calumet Audubon. They have a native plant sale at the Indiana Dunes Birding Festival every year at the Visitor Center in Chesterton. So you might notice that when you're buying native plants from a native plant sale, the plants are going to be a little smaller sometimes. They're just, they're baby plants, and that's how they often come. So you can buy them at plant sales, and we'll talk more about this. And there's some plant sales coming up, so I'll share those dates with you. But this is one option. You can also order them online, which I think is very cool. So I did an order from Possibility Place, and this is what they look like over on the right when they came. There was additional cardboard that held them in place, but this is what they look all spread out, and they came. Everyone survived to this point, so that was very exciting. So this was the area I wanted to put in a wildlife pond, and then I wanted to surround it with native plants. So we put in the pond, and then this is what my plan looked like initially. It went through some changes because there are some non-natives in here. And again, remember, I didn't set my goal up front. So I was just going along like, yeah, this is super fun, right? But I did adjust this so that they're all native. But I organized them into height. And then this is kind of the shape of my area. So I put circles where I wanted a plant to be. And so I knew I wanted like the tall guys. That's what the T is for in the back. And then some mediums here. And then I wanted some low ones in the front. And like when you're talking about native plants, tall and medium, that's pretty tall. So I knew that going in, I had listed all of this is the height and the width of it so that I could plan where things would look the best. So then I went out there and I placed them where I had them in my diagram. And then I wanted to do this myself. So I just went out over the course of the week and I dug up a little section of grass, and then I planted the plants that went in that section. And then I just went all the way around and did the whole thing. So here's the completed planting. And then I put a thick layer of mulch to help with moisture control and with weeds. So that was in June of 2023 when I planted them. And then this is that garden last year in August. So you could see that my goal was achieved of having a natural space. This is what I was going for. So if this looks a little bit wild to you, like you don't have to do it like this. That's okay. But that was my goal. So I'm so happy with this garden. It brings me so much joy. Um, and these are just a few of the flowering plants that are in this garden. And I just sit out there and just watch there's usually bumblebees. Those are the ones that I follow the most because they're big and charismatic. But I just love sitting out there and enjoying all the flowers in this space. And just one word of caution up here on the top left, this is obedient plant, which I think is one of the most beautiful plants. I love the like ombre thing happening when it's opening, but this is an aggressive spreader. So that's cool with me because I really like her, but this might be one to avoid if you don't have a lot of space and capacity for your plant to spread. Okay, so then if you do want to get into seeding, I want to tell you a little bit about this project. Actually, what happened, let me go back real quick. So this garden, this was when I planted it, right, in June. Well, by the end of June, the rabbits had come and eaten many of these plants, and I was very upset. And you'll see they all came back because when you cut off the leaves, then that just sends all the energy into the roots. So they'll come back the next year. But I was pretty upset about it because I had just done all this work and spent this money, and now my plants were gone. Again, I didn't have that intention of I'm doing this for wildlife. It's okay if some of them get eaten. Anyway, I asked someone, what do I do about the rabbits? How do I protect my plants from the rabbits? And they said, you need more plants. Basically, the answer is to have some plants for the rabbits, and then they eat some of them, but you have so many that they don't notice. And I said, well, I can't buy that many plants, so I'm going to try my hand at seeding. So I picked out this area of my yard and I killed the grass with tarps. These were down for about 3 months. They probably could have used a little bit more time. You can see like this section here gets sun, but the rest is a little bit shady. So in those areas, it didn't 100% kill it, but the plants came up enough to where they're shading it out. So it'll be fine now, but they could use, I would suggest a little bit more than 3 months. But it did die. So here's what it looked like after the tarps came up. This was probably in November. And then I actually ended up collecting about 90% of the seed that I put down, which was a lot of fun. But you know, it's like you can go volunteer with organizations to learn how to do that. And you of course need permission to collect seed. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But this is all the seed that I collected for my garden, and I just mixed it all together. And then I spread it over the winter. And then this is April. You could start to see little bitty green things. And then May, June, starting to come in a little bit. It's a little bit later in June. July, I was starting to get some. Remember, this is like that sunny patch. So this is what grew the fastest. And then August, it just exploded and was absolutely beautiful. And as I said, you are generally most plants are not going to bloom in their first year when you grow them from seed, but a few will. So black-eyed Susan and blue vervain are two that are going to definitely bloom in their first year. And that's really what made this garden so enjoyable. I was very prepared to have it be pretty lackluster in its first year, but those two really saved it. And I just enjoyed this so much. And the amount of pollinators that I saw in this garden was overwhelming. Really, really lovely. And one thing to note here, again, because I didn't go through that process of setting my intention in the beginning, I ended up adding in 1 flower's worth of Queen Anne's lace. So that's that white flower that you see. And Queen Anne's lace is not a native plant, but it was my favorite plant as a girl, and I had it in my wedding bouquet. Like I really loved Queen Anne's lace before I knew anything about it. And now I know that it is not native and it can be invasive in some circumstances. But I said, hey, it's my prairie planting. I can plant whatever I want, right? Like, no, Katie, you're trying to recreate nature. Anyway, in retrospect, I wish I hadn't added in the Queen Anne's lace, even though they are very beautiful. I have since pulled them out, and I'm sure I will be fighting them for years. But it was an early decision that I now regret, because seeds don't stay in your yard. Like I can control this in my garden, that's fine, but the birds come and they take the seeds and they take it elsewhere. That's why invasives are such a big issue. Um, so yeah, they've been removed, even though they are very lovely. Yeah, anyway. So now, because what I have is never enough, I'm constantly expanding this garden. Um, in this left picture, so this is that garden we were just looking at over here. So I put down tarps again and I killed the next section of lawn. So I'm going to be putting in a mulch path next to that original prairie planting. And this is the new seeding area. So I'm trying something different this year. Um, Instead of mixing all the seeds together, I created a grid and like measured everything out and created little sections. So there's like one thing is seeded in each 1 foot section. So I again organized them by height. So I got my tall, medium, low, low, and then I put the tall ones in the middle to medium, and then low on the edges, and I mix them up by color and by bloom time as well. And that is the new project. This is what it looks like right now because I just recently seeded it. Yeah, but I'm pretty excited about it. So stay tuned. You can follow along with Save the Dunes because I'm sure I'll be updating on how this goes. But I'm expecting that this one will not be quite as beautiful because generally when you grow from seed, the first year is not going to be spectacular, and I'm okay with that. I have patience. And even that original prairie planting, I mean, it was beautiful, but it's going to look completely different next year because I had like 3 things blooming this past year, and there's probably 30 different plants in that prairie. So it is going to look very different next year, this coming growing season, and I'm very excited about that. Anyway, so I just wanted to plant that idea in your head that if you love your starter garden and you decide, maybe I don't need all this lawn, I think that seeds are a really fun way to do that. And if you are new to native plants, but like seeds are intriguing, I want to plug winter sowing because it's a really great way to get plants for pretty cheap. And it's a fun winter activity. We're kind of coming to the end of the winter sowing season now, but you can still participate. I'm going to tell you how. So if you're not familiar with, you can do winter sowing with any kind of seed, not just native seeds. But you use some kind of container, most commonly a milk jug, and you cut it open and you put the seeds in wet soil, and then you tape it up, and then you just put it outside. So this can go through the cold stratification that most native seeds require. Like they need that period of cold and wet in order to grow the next season. So you just put them outside, and the snow and the rain keeps the soil moist. But you just kind of check it every once in a while, make sure it stays moist. And then as it gets warmer, those milk jugs act as a little greenhouse. So your plants get a kickstart in the spring, and they grow a little bit bigger than they would if you had them like just purely outside. So yeah, these are some that I sowed last year, and these went into that original prairie planting. This is, by the way, cup plant. Cup plant is like really good for winter sowing. So, but they're very tall. They're one of those like super tall plants. So you just gotta make sure that you're ready for that. Okay. So I want to give a plug to one of our partners, Shirley Hines Land Trust. They have a program called Grow One, Keep One. This is a like a milk jug sowing. It's not in the winter, so not technically winter sowing, I guess, but they have already done all that cold stratification part with the seeds, so they're ready to be grown. They have a volunteer day coming up on March 10th where they're preparing the milk jugs, and then probably, I think it's usually at the end of March where they have the call out for people to participate in this program. So you go to their office at in Valparaiso, and they like help you plant your milk jugs, and then you take them home and you care for them and you make sure that they stay watered and have them in the sun. And then at some point you bring them back and you give half of them back and you keep the other half. So you could just do 2 and you give 1 back and you keep 1, or you could do 10 and you give 5 back and you keep 5. So it's a great way to get some free plants and also help out Shirley Hines. They then use those plants to put in their nature preserves. So I've participated many times. It's a great program and a great way to learn about seeds. Okay, so let's talk about where to get seeds and plants. We'll start with seeds. If you don't go through Shirley Hines to get your free seeds, you can always collect them. This is my favorite, but you have to have permission. This does not fall under like foraging rules. You can't just go to a state park or the national park or a nature preserve and take seeds. That's not allowed. So if you have permission, like a great idea would be if your friend or a relative has native plants in their garden, maybe you can go over and learn a little bit about their garden and then collect seeds with them. If you don't have access, that's okay. You can purchase seeds. Prairie Moon, which we were talking about earlier, is a good educational resource for seeds. They sell them, or for plants in general. They sell plants and seeds. So you can go there to get some. And they sell like the individual seed packets and also in bulk. And then Stantec Native Plant Nursery also has bulk seeds, if that's what you're looking at. And I just have to point out this picture. This is a showy goldenrod, which is a non-aggressive version of goldenrod. And these are bumblebees that are sleeping on this flower, which I found so many sleeping bees. I thought the first time I saw one, I thought it was dead because they're just like frozen there. But I think it's most commonly the male bumblebees. The females go back to the hive, but the males are not invited into the hive. So they just like claw onto a flower at night and sleep there. It's really adorable. But there was this one flower that had 3 bees sleeping on it. So yeah, one of my favorites. Okay, and where to get native plants. So number one rule, never take plants from nature. It's never okay. So just don't do it. But you can go to local native plant sales, and there are several coming up. So there's the Gibson Wild Ones chapter on May 3rd. Friends of Indiana Dunes has their annual sale on May 10th. Miller Garden Club is also on May 10th. The Dunes Calumet Audubon has theirs at the Birding Festival. That's May 15 to 18. And Gabus Arboretum out of Valpo, they do an online order. So you have to do like a pre-order by May 1st, and then you pick it up on May 10th. So these are all great options. A lot of them will do like that pre-order, and they recommend that you like fill it out and submit it beforehand, but you can go and actually shop that day. It's just not guaranteed what's going to be there. And remember, you want to come to these with your list in hand. Don't just go and shop and say this likes sun and I have sun, because you don't know how it's going to behave if you haven't like done the research first. Now, there are a few other places that you can get plants. I mentioned that I did that online order, and that was from this top one, Possibility Place. So they will ship plants to your door, which is very convenient. And many of these listed here have online orders. So you can Google any of those to find their websites and how to get those plants. But it's good when you're buying plants to look for places that are near you, so that they're going to be like the genotype of the plant is going to be like specific to your area. Now, as far as garden stores, you want to be a little bit careful about buying native plants from big box stores, I guess you could say. My favorite, if you want to just like go out and shop, is Chesterton Feed and Garden in Chesterton. They do have a nice selection of true native plants. So I highly recommend going and checking them out. But for most garden stores, mostly what you're going to find are going to be cultivars. And so I just want to take a little detour to talk about cultivars for a minute, because this is another one of those things that it wasn't on my radar until I started doing gardening. And I have cultivars in my garden because I just didn't know about them. So how to find out if something is a cultivar? So you'll look at the plant tag, and like Echinacea, great, native plant, right? But then it has this second name in quotes. That means that it's a cultivar. So it's our ruby giant cultivar. Spiderwort, hey, this is a nice native plant. This is an aggressive one, just FYI, so be prepared for this to spread. But we're gonna make it, there we go. So spiderwort's all good, but then Concord grape in the quotes. This is a cultivar. Black-eyed Susan, great native plant, one of my favorites, right? Goldstrum in quotes. That means that this is a cultivar. So what actually is a cultivar? This is a plant variety that has been produced in cultivation by selective breeding to achieve a certain trait. So maybe they're trying to change the color of the flower, change the color of the leaf, make it smaller, like a more compact plant. Maybe it's pest resistant, maybe it doesn't spread as much, so it's not aggressive. Maybe it's disease resistant, maybe it blooms longer. There's a lot of different traits that plants are selected for, but it's that process of cultivating the plant for a specific trait. Another term you're going to hear a lot is nativar, and that's just referring to a cultivar of a native plant. They mash the words together to get nativar. So cultivar and nativar, basically talking about the same thing. So the general rule is it's best to choose true native species whenever you possibly can. But the degree to which you do this is going to go back to what your goals are. So my goals are to have natural habitat, rewilding my yard, right? So I don't want nativars. I want true native species. But if that's not your goal and you really need your garden to stay very compact, then maybe you would consider adding some nativars because they are selectively bred to do that thing that you need it to do. There's not a lot of research out yet. There's still a lot more needed, and it's kind of ongoing to understand the impacts of this cultivation for some plants and some types of cultivars. Those changes impact the nutritional value of that plant. So we know for sure that nativars or cultivars that are bred to have darker leaves are ones to avoid because that messes with the nutrition of the leaves. So insects that are eating those leaves are not getting the nutrition that they need from them. We know for sure that if they are bred to have more petals or like a double bloom, that makes the plant sterile. So it's not going to be providing that nectar or pollen for pollinators, and it's not developing seed, which birds eat during the winter. So double blooms are ones to avoid. And then there's also some thought that if it's bred to have a different petal color, that those special relationships that formed over thousands of years between the plants and the insects, the insects, some of the really specialized ones know what color that flower is. And so if it's a different color, they're not going to come to it. So these are just some things to consider. And if you can choose true native species, that's certainly my preference, but it's not going to be the answer for every garden. You just have to do the best you can with what you have available to you, right? But I could tell you right here, this is a picture of Black-Eyed Susan, that Goldstrum, that tag that we just looked at over here on the right. That sure is what's right there in my pond planting because I didn't know what a cultivar was when I put in this pond. So it is staying quite small and compact, and it's fine. Maybe one day I'll move it, but for now it's okay, but I don't see a lot of pollinators on it, to be honest. So beware cultivars, at least be aware that that is a thing, and use your best judgment based on what your goals are. Care and maintenance of your garden. Once you have it all planted, you're going to want to keep your young plants watered during their first year, just like any other garden. They need to get established. And especially during dry spells for like the first 2-ish years, you're going to want to provide some water if we're like in a drought. Once the plants are really established, they're adapted to drought conditions, right? They've been here and we've always had some droughts. So they'll be okay in the long run, but in the short term, you want to keep them watered. And mulch really does help retain moisture. And if you do like a thick layer of mulch, then that will help with weeds as well. So would recommend using mulch, ideally mulch that does not have dye in it. You're going to want to weed often while your plants are getting established so that they're not competing for the nutrients in the soil with other weeds. Do not use pesticides. This is a pretty hard line. Do not use pesticides in your native garden. Native gardens are inviting in native plants or native insects. And then if you're using pesticides, you're then killing those insects. So those are cross-purpose things. So you should not use pesticides in your native garden. And then use pollinator-friendly practices when cleaning up your garden in the fall. And this includes things like leaving the leaves, because the leaves are where a lot of pollinators, insects, small mammals, amphibians, reptiles, that's where they spend the winter in our region. They go into those leaves and they overwinter there. So if you remove them all, you are removing the insects and the pollinators from your yard. So your garden is a really great place to put those leaves. These are just a few of the places in my yard where I collect my leaves. They're mostly in the backyard, but this one here is in the front yard with my maple leaves because it made a very pretty mulch. So, so leaving the leaves is important. Also leaving your plant stems as much as you can. So this is that same prairie garden. This is what it looked like, I don't know, like last week, before all the snow melted. I think it's quite pretty, but inside, some of the stalks of your native plants are hollow, and so native bees burrow into there and they lay their eggs. So there might be eggs in there might be developing pupa, or there could be adults in there. So leaving those stems is very, very critical for pollinator conservation. If you like this, I probably wouldn't leave this degree in my front yard. So if you do need to clean up a little bit, you can like cut them at different heights and then kind of bale them together and lean them up against a structure like a shed or a garage, just so the things inside can have a chance of surviving over the winter. And then in the spring, you can compost them or do whatever you're going to do. But saving them is ideal. And then spring garden cleanup. So we just said that things are in the leaves, right? They're in the stem stalks over the winter. Most pollinators rely on warming temperatures to tell them when it's time to come out of their winter hiding place. So we wait until we have 7 consecutive days of 50-degree temperatures before removing all of your garden debris. Because generally after 7 days, the pollinators and all the other critters in your leaf litter have gotten the message, they've woken up and they've left, so it's safe to take those away. So this is something that we're going to be talking about soon as temperatures start to warm and folks start to go out to clean up their garden. Please wait until we have 7 days of consecutive 50-degree weather. So these are a couple of graphics if you want to download them to share them. I put the website there to the blog where they are listed. But we'll also be sharing these graphics in the coming weeks. So if you're just following along with Save the Dunes, you'll be able to share them there as well. But spreading this message is very important because all of the conservation work that we do in the gardening and we're leaving the leaves just to clean up our gardens too soon and getting rid of all those pollinators is just very tragic to me. So if we could spread this word, that would be terrific. And finally, last thing. I personally learn best from doing, and so I wanted to invite you to some opportunities to do the same at our headquarters at the Barker House in Michigan City, not Barker Mansion, but Barker House, which is on Barker Road. We installed a demonstration pollinator garden last fall. And our goal is to host events there so that community members can come and work in the garden with us to learn about the process of how to maintain a garden. So these are 2 upcoming volunteer days where we're just going to be working in the garden, and it's an opportunity, if you're interested, to come out and work with us and just kind of learn more about the process and about native plants. I'd also recommend checking out Shirley Hines Land Trust and the Indiana Dunes National Park. They have very robust volunteer programs, and they're always doing different volunteer events like collecting seed and going out and working in the field. And it's just a really fantastic way of learning. So just wanted to offer that. Okay, I did it. I'm done. Amanda, how did I do?
Fantastic as always, Katie. Thank you so much for taking the time to share this with us. And we do have some questions for you.
Okay.
Right, so we have one about, suggestions for how to remove invasive species. And so there's a specific question related to that about burning bush.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question, and I'm glad that you asked it, because that's the right thing to be thinking about. As much as adding native plants is beneficial, removing invasive species is like equally beneficial. So the more you could do with that, the better. Generally with with like shrub, bush type things, you're going to want to cut those at the base and then apply a little herbicide directly, like paint it onto the stump so that it doesn't regrow. Um, and generally we do that in the fall. So that's what I would recommend there. But you can like hire a contractor if you have a big job. Um, and there's also a lot of really great information online. So if like you need details on a specific species of invasive plants, there's like a plethora of knowledge online as well. If you do not kill the roots, or remove the roots, there is a chance that it will continue to send up, new plants. Um, so that is why it's recommended that you paint on a layer of herbicide because that will go down and kill the roots. But if you're not comfortable doing that, then removing the roots is really like the foolproof way to do that. So I would say if you don't want to use herbicide, or if you want to plant something else there, those would be like two key reasons to remove the roots. But if you're okay with it staying and you're okay with using the herbicide, then I don't think you necessarily need to. But it's kind of going to depend on the bush as well. If it's really, really big and established there, then the herbicide might not do it. So you might have to get in there and pull it out, which would be a job, but a worthwhile job.
The next question is about soil. Did you do any kind of soil testing to find out what kind of soil you were dealing with or if it had been altered in any way? Essentially, how did you, if you did at all, prepare the soil before you started planting?
So I knew that I had clay. So I'm in Valparaiso, so it's like there's generally pretty clay dense soil in my area, and from other gardening projects, I knew the kind of soil that I had. Um, Generally, with native plants, you don't need or want to be adding like fertilizer to your soil because remember, they're from this area. They are acclimated to our normal soil. So they are not going to do well with a whole bunch of fertilizers. It's too much for their system. So you could like mix in some compost to your top layer of soil if you want to add some nutrients. That would be okay. I chose not to do that just because of the size of my projects, and they've been doing well. You can get this is a choose your own adventure kind of situation. You can get into a bunch of rabbit holes depending on what interests you. So if you want to get like really deep into soil chemistry, like that is an option for you. That's not something that like sparks joy for me. So that's not something that I really investigated. And I was just kind of going from lawn that we did not, fertilize or put pesticides on to bare ground. So I didn't feel the need to do that.
All right, we have a question about if you could explain why burning bush is considered an invasive plant.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, burning bush is not originally from our region, and it does spread very aggressively. Not This is one of those situations where it's not like it sends up babies all around it, right? You have a bush and you're not like inundated with bushes then. But burning bush has a berry on it that birds really love. So birds come and they eat the berries, and then they go elsewhere and they poop out the seeds. And then that's where the new burning bushes grow. So by and large, you're not going to see the impacts of many of our like the bush or tree versions of invasive species, like Callery pear or Bradford pear is another name for it, is a good example. These plants, they're sold in garden stores, so like of course people are buying them and putting them in their yard, like of course they are. And then the birds take the seeds elsewhere into natural areas, and then they grow out of control. So that's what's happening with burning bush, is they're taking the berries and spreading them elsewhere largely into like undeveloped areas, like into nature preserves, into the national park, that kind of thing.
Again, Katie, thank you so much for taking the time to share this information with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I hope I hope that I gave you some good information and inspired you to install your next good native plant. And my email is right here. Please send me pictures if you do. I would love to see the wonderful things that you come up with.